Världen som vi känner den ritas om i rasande fart. Vaccinpass införs och nya restriktioner begränsar de ovaccinerades möjlighet att delta i samhället. Samtidigt sker enorma protester runt om i världen. I USA slutar tusentals vårdanställda och läkare, poliser och brandmän på grund av vaccintvång. I Italien har många månader av konkurs och växande fattigdom drivit ut hundratusentals människor på gator och torg. Protesterna handlar om rätten att röra sig fritt i samhället, om rätten att bestämma över sin egen kropp, om oron över att barn nu ska påtvingas ett vaccin vars konsekvenser för hälsan inte är klarlagda. En del av detta har du kanske hört om på nyheterna, men det är mycket som inte rapporteras. Det är därför vi gör detta svep över världen, där vi pratar med människor som bor i dessa länder om hur de ser på utvecklingen. Det här programmet ska handla om Australien. Landet som många förknippar med milsvida stränder och en avslappnad livsstil verkar närma sig en kokpunkt. Där allt hårdare restriktioner och tvångsåtgärder möts av allt större protester. Vi samtalar med Krystle Mitchell i Victoria, som efter 16 år som polis valt att lämna sitt yrke och ansluta sig till proteströrelsen. So hi, great to have you on, Krystle Mitchell from Victoria. I would like to begin to ask you about the last weekend. I heard there was a huge protest in Australia. Were you there?
Yes, I was. In fact, the last 2 weekends, there's been mammoth protests in every state across Australia, protesting against various pieces of legislation, protesting against mandatory vaccinations through coercion, protesting against vaccine passports, and protesting against medical segregation within our communities. The protests have been absolutely inspiring, so motivating to see so many hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Australians standing up, both vaccinated and unvaccinated, people from all political persuasions, but banding together under the one belief that a free and democratic society doesn't operate in the manner in which our state and federal governments are attempting to lead us down.
Can you share with us some impressions from the latest rally?
Some impressions. So the most recent one that I attended this last weekend, my impressions were just how much evidence there was of what a multicultural society, Victoria especially, truly is. There was flags being flown by the rally demonstrators from virtually every country in the world. And that was inspiring to see, because what that showed me was that this truly is a rally for the people, for all people from diverse cultures, that have come together because democracy is such a fundamental, unifying, thing to argue and fight for. So that was my first impressions. The other things that I noticed were just the diversity of people that were there. So mums and dads, doctors, nurses, ambulance officers, ex-police officers, firefighters, tradies, so construction workers, students, children who have been locked out of school, out of playgrounds, out of their sporting events. It was just such a diverse group of people from all walks of life, and they were so friendly and peaceful. It was just a joyful occasion in the rally, despite the fact that what they were rallying against was such a draconian and sad state of affairs.
So, and how is the media portraying these protests? I know that in Sweden, for instance, often they try to portray these people as some kind of extremist, right-wing, and so on.
how does the Australian media portray the protests?
Unfortunately, we have the same situation here with that false media narrative about the protests. And it's very disappointing that they, for whatever reason, don't want to report accurately and fairly what is happening on the streets. But we have seen that in reality through the entirety of the pandemic. And so now we have a situation where the people themselves are turning away from mainstream media, and they're just turning their TVs off. They're not watching the main news channels because they know that they're not going to get the truth. So people are turning to alternative independent media, which is very freely available online for the moment, and they're looking to places like Real Rukshan, Topher Field, RV Yemenimi at Rebel News, Reignite Democracy Australia, I think Free Independent Australian Network, something along those lines. And there's just so many quality independent journalists that are getting out on the streets, and they're recording their footage live. And so I think, and sharing that live. And so the main difference is that you'll have the mainstream media come to these events and they'll take a very short snippet of something that happens at an event, and then that will be their main focus of the story. And they will spend an inordinate amount of time discussing perhaps, some small issue that occurred amongst, one or two protesters, and then sort of paint that as the picture of, the true, the representation of the people that were there, which is in fact entirely inaccurate. So it seems to be a worldwide agenda by these mainstream media moguls to be very reluctant to report the truth. And interestingly enough, it actually was one of the things that was part of my journey and motivated me to go from police officer to quitting essentially live on interview, was the fact that I live in the city of Melbourne. And so I walk my dogs every day, and I would see these protests occurring. Then I would see how the media reported them on television. And I thought, that's not what I saw. So then I started to plan my exercise of my dogs, because we were only allowed outside of our house for 1 hour a day. I would plan my exercise at the same time that these protests were occurring so that I could go and see firsthand for myself. And I would walk the fringe of the protest, and I would watch and observe. And I had a first-hand account of what truly was going on, how the police were interacting, what the mood of the mass protesters were. And then I was watching the news, and I was seeing a very disparate representation. And that was, part of my journey into really becoming distrustful about what the media was presenting to us as truth.
And also, when you see the images from Australia, this is so massive. It's hundreds of thousands of people in the street. One problem we have had in Europe a lot is what we call the controlled opposition. So there are networks that you don't know exactly who's behind it, and it's being infiltrated with all kinds of people and troublemakers, and it makes it very easy for the mass media to portray it in a bad way, and also maybe it has this effect on some people that they don't want to join them and so on. So do you have any of that you know about in Australia with the so-called controlled opposition?
I think so. Certainly when I was a police officer and I attended protests to facilitate the safe passage of protesters and to shut streets down so that they could march, it certainly was something that we were provided in our briefings, that there are people and agitators that will attend these events that have a counter view to the main protest cohort. It was never sold to me, and nor would I have believed that it was something that we orchestrated as an organisation, but it was something that we were made aware of, that counter groups, infiltrators essentially would come and try and disrupt the main messages, the key points, and try to incite violence. So I have no doubt that those things would also be occurring during the Freedom Rally protests. Where those agitators come from, that's I couldn't say that that's something that has been orchestrated by, any political affiliation or government agency. That's not to say that it doesn't happen. It's just that I don't have any evidence that would support that.
So when you were walking there this weekend in this massive protest, could you feel that this is really like history in the making?
Absolutely. There was a few times where I just wanted to stop and take stock of and appreciation of the moment, for exactly that reason, that this is history in the making and that this is something that I want to remember and be proud of, so that if I'm lucky enough to make it to a 90-year-old nana, I can look back with nostalgia at this really bad, troubling, disturbing time in our history, but be proud of what I did and what I stood for, and be proud of all of the other Victorians and Australians that marched alongside me in a monumental moment in history of really something that our generation and perhaps the generation before us has never had to fight for their freedoms to the extent that we're having to fight for them now.
So tell us about your own journey, how you started to doubt what you were doing as a police officer and why you left.
I'm trying to reflect on probably, what was the first thing. And I'd probably have to say it was the hypocrisy of the COVID rules, the safety rules that we were being asked to implement internally within the police force. I was actually the COVID safety officer for my floor. And so there was a whole bunch of rules and regulations that I had to go through and ensure that staff were adhering to. And it just seemed like it was all a bit put on. It was all just for a show. They weren't really taken very seriously by a lot of people. And so to me, this initial thought was, well, if this virus is as serious as we're being told it is, then why is there just sort of this lackadaisical response to it from within my own organisation that is sort of being told to be the forefront leaders of implementing these COVID-safe plans and policies. So that was probably the start of, well, maybe this doesn't add up, maybe this isn't as serious as they say it is, because if it was, then, we would certainly see a more serious response internally, as opposed to perhaps just putting it on, it's not play acting, but it just didn't seem to be taken very seriously. So after that, it was listening to what was being told about COVID and the different responses that different premiers were taking in different states. And I just thought, well, if this is a health crisis and if this is a health situation, then as one country, we should be operating one approach. And there shouldn't be different rules for different places, because if it's a health issue and a health crisis, well, then sort of the protections that are needed should operate equally for everybody. And what became apparent to me was that it became just class warfare very, very quickly. So if you were rich and you had things available to you, then you could sort of continue to operate your daily life, not really being very affected by all of these rules. If a health crisis is so serious that you need to lock people in their homes, then why is it that the punishment, if you don't do that, is a fine that really only affects the middle and lower income earners? These arbitrary fines don't affect rich people. I mean, it's water off a duck's back to them. So that was another thing that I sort of questioned. That, well, if this is a health crisis that we're really concerned about, then surely the measures that we're putting in place should be for the protection of everybody, and everybody should have to follow the same rules. But that's not what we saw. And then that graduated to, what we were just talking about before, the media talking about people who were standing up against the lockdowns and against the infringements on our civil liberties, and seeing firsthand how that was actually playing out in reality on the streets. So it was sort of this, graduation process through learning and identifying and looking and just thinking critically about what I was being told within the workplace, what I was seeing in the media, what I was seeing on the streets publicly, and then, overarching that was this change in the response that Victoria Police had in the way it was dealing with people on the streets. So initially, the messaging from Victoria Police was very much, it was supposed to be an education campaign, and we were there to support the community in understanding what their, rules and responsibilities were during a COVID pandemic. And that shifted very much into, a bit of a totalitarian enforcement threat approach, which then escalated into full-blown, we're going to fire rubber bullets at fleeing unarmed protesters because they've gathered to fight for their liberties. You can't watch that. You can't live in that environment and see this progression through all of these things and not act. Everybody has a line in the sand, and I guess I just reached my line in the sand and I said, I can't go on anymore. I don't want to work for an organisation that is prepared to treat its people like this. I don't want to work for an organisation that is going to enforce, show me your papers. That is not what I signed up to be a police officer for. None of this is what I signed up to be a police officer for. And I've reached my line in the sand. I can't go on any further. I have to say something. I have to step up. It felt like I had no other choice at that point in time.
So how did you, when you were talking with colleagues, did you feel that there were other police officers as well that were feeling that this is not what I came here to do, and or were most of them sympathetic with what they were being told to do?
No, the vast majority of frontline police officers that I've spoken to were not pro the enforcement processes that they had to do. Initially, there was no issues with education campaigns, handing out masks, giving people instructions on social distancing and the different rules, answering phone calls at the watch house of the police station to give people advice. Because, that's part of your role as a police officer, is to help and support the community. So at the initial response, it's not necessarily why you join the police force, but hey, this pandemic's arrived and, Victoria Police, as officers, we need to step up and do our bit. So initially, yes, there was support for it. As the police involvement became more coercive, totalitarian and enforcement-like, there was a shift, and police, frontline police were telling me definitely that this is not what they signed up for. They thought that a lot of the enforcement measures were pointless. They weren't having the desired effect that the government was claiming that they should have. It was doing more harm than good in terms of the relationship between police and community. And it just was not conducive to Peel's principles of policing and, the cooperation that police need to have with community to be effective police in their communities.
So do you remember the pivotal moment when it came, when you just said, I'm leaving?
It was the tradie protest. I don't know if you know anything about the tradie protest that happened in Melbourne, but the Premier of Victoria initiated vaccine mandates for tradies, for construction workers, and there was a protest against that. And it was quite a big protest, and I don't think that the police had been prepared for it. and there was some violence on both sides. There was a lot of, very angry people that had attended their union office to express their dissatisfaction with the union boss, who ultimately, a few weeks earlier, I believe, he had said that he would support tradies in fighting against mandates, and then he backflipped and basically just sided with the government and said, no, despite the fact that, I'm the trade union member and I work for you, I'm going to support the government's mandate. And if you basically, it was a mandate by coercion. If you don't get these vaccines, then you will not be allowed on trade sites, which means that you can't work, which means that you don't draw an income. Those protesters, they walked past my house. They walked past my house on Wurundjeri Way, a street here in Victoria, and then up onto the Westgate Bridge. And I watched it, and I watched them in their thousands marching. They then returned from the bridge and walked past my house again on their way home. And I had stopped outside my building, and I spoke with a tradie who needed to use the bathroom, and he was an Indian gentleman, and he was there with some friends. And I just said, oh, look, I just live upstairs. You're welcome to come up and use my bathroom if you like, because there was no public toilets around. And they'd been marching for several hours. So, he ums and ahs, and then his friend said, oh, no, go, it's okay. Go use her bathroom. So he came up into my apartment, and we're in the lift together. And he says, so what do you do? And I said, well, I'm a police officer, actually. And just the look on his face, the poor thing. But I said, look, I support what you're doing. I support your right to protest. I support you standing up for your liberties and freedoms and your right to choose. And he said that he was vaccinated, but he was there to stand for his co-workers who had not yet been vaccinated or, had not yet made a decision, and he wanted to stand and fight for them. And, after that protest, the Premier of Victoria, it was like a knee-jerk reaction. He shut down the entire construction industry for 2 weeks. It was almost like a punishment. How dare you stand up and protest against something that I've mandated? So to show you who's in power, to show you who's in force, I'm going to initiate a 2-week complete shutdown of your entire industry. So it was a punishment for everybody. And it was a way for him, the Premier, to divide those construction workers, because you had construction workers who didn't attend the protest and they were locked out of their jobs. They couldn't work for 2 weeks. And he caused this division. And that was enough for me. I just thought, no, I cannot continue to sit and by and not say anything and watch this Premier cause division and hate amongst our community. I've already seen him consistently do it in the way that he's been using police and the way that police are being hated on in Victoria as a result of our involvement in the pandemic response. I think it might have even been that day I called up Matt Wong and I said, hi, this is what I want to do. I've seen you do interviews with other people before, and I like the way that you do it. This is what I want to do. What do you think? And it just grew from there. And then I think a week or so later, I went and did his interview.
Tell us about the situation right now in Australia. What is the latest developments with mandates and restrictions and so on?
So obviously the media and our state premiers have jumped on this new variant. And as a result, there's been restrictions, travel bans, and quarantine requirements for people entering the country. We've banned people from entering Australia from 8 countries where the variant is in existence. Lockdowns continue for unvaccinated people. There are severe lockdowns in the Northern Territory, in small, remote Aboriginal villages where there were no cases of COVID whatsoever. Here in Victoria, if you are not vaccinated, you are locked out of society, all except for your ability to go to the grocery store and to go to a chemist. I'm reading stories from people that are struggling to get doctor's appointments because they're not vaccinated, people who have had their children injured and needed to be taken to hospital, and the parents denied access to go into the hospital with their child because the parent is not vaccinated. Children are not allowed to attend pools and sporting events if they're under the age, if they're 12 and over and they're not vaccinated. Children under that age can't attend if their parents are not vaccinated. So there is a huge segregation in society right now, and there's a lot of vitriol from the extreme left, I would say, in terms of saying that they believe that they have a right to not have to sit on a bus next to an unvaccinated person. And it's just incredible, the lack of critical thinking to the parallels to Rosa Parks and that statement that these people are making, when vaccinated and unvaccinated people obviously can spread COVID amongst other illnesses, and not being vaccinated doesn't make you a sick individual or an individual capable of spreading something that you don't have. So there is still a lot of segregation. It's called, the vaxxed versus the unvaxxed economy.
Yeah, it's called divide and conquer, the tactics. We have the same thing here, unfortunately. I think also social media plays a huge part in this, that people are in these filter bubbles, as you call them. And but still, when you see these crowds of hundreds of thousands of people, like you had in Australia last weekend, you still have the feeling that there is also a very strong community.
Absolutely. I think that the silver lining for me in quitting my job and effectively being unemployed now is that this experience has opened me up to a whole world of people that I never would have had the pleasure of meeting. And they are like-minded individuals who respect the sanctity of the individual and personal choices. And that community is very large and is growing exponentially. I think that the mainstream media, they show images of full restaurants, that things are back to normal, that, the unvaccinated group of people are just such a minority that it isn't going to impact the economy. But I was at the shops today. I was at a shop called DFO, which is like a very large building that houses lots of different shops. So shoes, clothing, food, expensive handbags, cheap jewelry, all of the different fancy brand names and so forth. So it's just one big old warehouse, I guess, of all of these different shops. And it's Christmas time. It's the 1st of December in Victoria generally, especially at a DFO, which is what the place is called. It would be packed with people. It would be huge. You'd struggle to get room in between people to get into the shops because they all have sales on at the moment, and everybody would be busy buying up their Christmas presents. But these shops were empty. Some of them were still closed. The shops that were open had 1 or 2 customers in the store in total. So again, I think the media is showing you one thing. The economy's fine and, everything's getting back to normal. But you go out and in reality you have a look and it's like, well, actually it's not. And I think that people are making a stand, vaccinated or not, and they're choosing where to spend their money. And ultimately, I think people are choosing to not go to places that are enforcing medical segregation and are choosing to spend that money in other shops and businesses that are supportive of people's individual choices.
I think one very strong feeling that people have had all around the world from the beginning almost is that their own government is no longer, if they ever were, working for them. They have something else in mind, and they have an agenda which is not benign. What do you think is the agenda that the Australian government is perpetrating?
That is a good question, and I think that you could delve into many different rabbit holes around what is the agenda. And it's a good question, and it's one that I have pondered. What is the purpose of all of this? And I'm not entirely sure if it is, the focus of what people have talked about with Carl Schwab and the Great Reset, Agenda 21, which, you do some reading and you think, oh, yeah, some of that makes sense, and that seems to be a direction. For me personally, when I look at how free or supposedly free and democratic countries have operated throughout this pandemic, what I personally feel is that this is almost a way of governments trying to bring in communism and socialism into democratic countries without a real fight, without a proper debate, without a vote from the people to say, hey, would you like to change the way in which we operate as a country? Australia is a democracy, and it seems like if you look at all of the actions that our governments at a local and federal level have taken, to me, it just seems like it's the logical explanation is that they are pushing us to a path of communism and socialism without proper debate and discourse and exploration as to whether or not that's the path that the people want to take. But obviously, you would not do that in a communist or socialist regime. You wouldn't give the people a choice, right? So that's what I believe is happening now.
Yeah. I think Mussolini, the founder of fascism, he said that in his ideal society, you shouldn't be able to roll a cigar paper between the government and the big businesses. So in a way, that's also a little bit what we have today. You have the World Economic Forum, basically the richest people and companies and banks in the world dictating to the local governments what they're supposed to do. So that's also pretty far away from a national democracy.
Absolutely, and that's one of the reasons why I joined the Liberal Democratic Party here in Australia.
Tell us about your political career now.
So yes, it's jumped from policing into a political career. So I'm now a Senate candidate for the Liberal Democratic Party, and I'm running for the Federal Senate of Australia, representing Victorians. And the reason that I have chosen to work with this party is because they hold true Liberal policies, which is about a reduced government, a return of decisions and freedoms to the people, let people make decisions about their own lives, and governments to be much less obtrusive and to remove red tape and bureaucracy that's just simply not needed. Some of the policies that we have proposed are, reducing, duplicated departments within government by 10%, reducing their budgets by 1%, I think, every year thereafter until the deficit is reached. Every single politician taking a 10% pay cut, because if the rest of society has suffered during COVID, then why shouldn't politicians also see a reduction in their wage? The Liberal Democrats very much are a grassroots political party. They have been in existence for 20 years, so they do know what they're talking about, and they do have well-enshrined policies, but they are people from the community there for a purpose to serve the community. So we don't have agendas with big corporations. My vote can't be bought. If a policy or a bill is introduced into the federal parliament and I'm a senator and that bill doesn't serve the best interests of the Australian people, it will not get my vote. That's what the Liberal Democrats stand for, is not to be bought out by big business, not to be simply and purely available to the elite. I'm available on, a number of different social platforms, and, I let anybody that wants to friend request me on these platforms be my friend, send me a message, ask me a question. Politicians should be available to the communities that they serve. And that's what the Liberal Democrats are. And that's why I joined them. And that's why I want to, hopefully be a part of a political revolution that is very much needed now to fight against this sleepwalking into tyranny, which is, a comment that I picked up tonight in one of our Liberty chats with our Liberal Democrat Party. We are sleepwalking into tyranny as a whole society, and that's what I want to fight against. And I want to see a political revolution in every democracy across the world where there is this creeping of communism and socialism into these democratic societies that just shouldn't be there.
There is also, in these days, it's so much fake news and I think that's also sometimes a strategy. There's so much rumors and news, so after a while you don't really know what's true or not. So I wanted to ask you about a few things that have emerged from Australia. One thing we have seen is called the emergency call from the Aborigines of Australia. Do you know if they say basically that their rights are being trampled upon and police are entering into their territories and forcing them to, I don't know, even force vaccinating them? Do you know anything about what's going on there?
I don't have first-hand accounts because I haven't been to those particular communities within the Northern Territory. I have worked with the Northern Territory Police in the past, and I don't want to detract from people's voices if that is, in fact, what's occurring. But from what I have been able to find on social media myself is that the people that are making these claims aren't people directly from those communities. They haven't been able to produce any live feed of police or army going in and forcibly vaccinating anybody. The socials that I have seen are other Aboriginal people talking and sharing their concerns that they're hearing stories, but they don't know whether or not these things are actually occurring. I believe that absolutely there are health teams going into these communities and encouraging people to be vaccinated. I don't know anything else other than what you've seen and what I've been able to find on socials as well. But yeah, there's nothing, there's no direct evidence from people within those communities themselves saying that that's occurring. But I have seen social media footage from elders, so that's respected elder Aboriginal people within those local communities that have come out and said that they are working with authorities, they are working with health teams to encourage vaccination within those communities. The Premier of Northern Territory, Chief Minister, I should say, he's not a Premier, he has come out and said that there have been certain groups of Aboriginal people taken to Howard Springs, which is the quarantine centre in Northern Territory, and they're isolating as infected or close contacts of COVID positive people. But that's not dissimilar to anybody else within the Northern Territory that has been taken to Howard Springs as a quarantine facility.
And there's also news about concentration camps. I don't know if that's the right appropriate term, but that they're building isolation facilities for people who have been tested positive and so don't want to vaccinate.
Well, that's the thing. It's time will tell what those camps are actually used for. So those facilities are being built, and we've seen the video footage of those being built near airports. We're having one built, I think, in Mickleham in Victoria. The claim is that it's for overseas travellers that are coming into Australia, and that the future is that these facilities will be used for overseas travellers coming here. That's how it's been sold to the community at the moment. Time will tell. There are concerns, and I think that they are well-founded concerns that these facilities will be used for other things. And it has been intimated by various premiers in the different press conferences that they do that these facilities, could be used for a number of things. And, they've talked about various, state emergencies. So if there was a flood or a fire and people were homeless, that these facilities could be used for that. Obviously, they're not going to come out and say straight away that these facilities are going to be used to round up every single unvaccinated person and lock them up until they take the vaccine. But you can understand why people would be concerned that that could be a possibility or a reality in the future, given the way that unvaccinated people are being treated in Australia at present.
Another thing I've heard, which I don't know if it's true, is that the government has hired private contractors because they know that some of the police won't do the biddings of the government in the more extreme ways. Is that true?
Yes, so there are people called authorised officers, and they're not police officers. And those authorised officers are the ones that are asking, show me your papers. They are entering businesses and demanding proof of vaccination statuses of all employees within that business, all customers that are in that business at that time. And I think that it's been done because it's an optics issue. The governments don't want footage of police officers going in and doing that because it will, be very reminiscent of the footage that we've seen from World War II, where you had people in uniform demanding to see the papers of certain classes of people. So I think that they've done it deliberately so that these authorised officers can just wear plain clothes. They don't wear uniforms, but they are, in essence, policing and demanding, show me your papers within the community and, fining businesses, fining people who are seen to, not have evidence of their vaccination.
So it's fascism in disguise.
It is. It is absolutely. I think that's a good way of putting it. It is fascism in disguise. And maybe it's just trying to lull people into a false sense of security, and let's wait and see again, because these authorised officers, whilst they're operating now, I can't imagine that it will take long for there to be a physical altercation between patrons and these authorised officers, and we will see a graduation to armed officers, police officers, PSOs, being the ones to then enter those businesses to affect those rules. And we are in fact seeing that where people do enter a business and, they refuse to show their vaccination record. So the police are called and the police are responding and arresting people that are entering businesses where they have not shown their vaccination record.
So before we round up, I wanted to ask you also about in Sweden and in also other countries. I've interviewed people. When people have serious adverse events, side effects from the vaccine, it's very hard sometimes to get the understanding from the healthcare, and the media don't always report about it, and the agencies that are the medical agency, which is supposed to deal with it, usually downplays this and says this has nothing to do with the vaccine. Do you know anything about the situation in Australia where people have been injured or have had severe adverse events?
I've spoken with nurses directly who have reported witnessing adverse events and have been instructed by their superior nurse officers to not record them. I have not got any first-hand evidence of that because I don't work in the industry, but these people are verified as nurses, or they were nurses, and then, they have refused to disclose their vaccination status, so they're no longer practicing nurses now. So there has been some stories of, a reluctance to report adverse events through the appropriate channels. I did read an interesting article by, I think it was a doctor, or he was a vaccine maker, and he had an adverse reaction, and he wrote an article about, he still was very supportive of people getting vaccinated, and he said, that his reaction was rare, but he reported his own story of the difficulties that he had in getting his doctor or the specialist that he was referred to in reporting his own adverse reaction. So that was from a respected medical person within the field who faced those barriers. So you can only imagine the other people out there that are facing that issue that aren't getting that sort of airtime.
So I guess that the government in Australia now is in a situation where they are, as you say, they're trying to divide and conquer a population where there's a growing discontent, and the police force is still keeping it together. How do you see things playing out in the nearest year or so?
I think that it will go one of two ways. I think that we will either see a revolution of the century where the people fight back in a democratic and safe way, and we win, or we will see further segregation and degradation of society as we know it, and we will truly become a two-tiered system. Class warfare will grow exponentially. I think that there'll be more violence, more crime, just a less happier place to live in the world. And so I think that there's two extremes really, and I'm over here. I really want this one. I want the revolution, the political revolution, the engagement of people to be interested in politics like they never have been before, because I think that a big part of why we're in the situation we're in is because of political apathy, and I was absolutely guilty of that also. I didn't really pay attention to politics. I didn't really think that it affected my life, and I'm hoping that because of the experience that we've been through collectively, and we've seen just how much intrusion a government can have on our lives, that people stand up and they pay attention, they take notice, they get involved in political activism, join a political party, start having political conversations with your friends and family, and more important than ever is to vote, and vote properly, vote below the line on the ballot tickets. Vote for the minority parties that stand up for your freedoms, liberty and justice, and vote out the Labor, the Liberal and the Green parties who have been dominating our political landscape and have failed us miserably.
All right. Thank you very much. Hope to speak to you again sometime soon.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.